My name is Stephanie from Climbing the Seven Summits. I'm here with Anthony. Go ahead and get us started today.
Yes, thank you. We are here to talk about breathwork training for mountaineers. We have a ton of good stuff to cover today. So I'm going to go ahead and dive right in. And what we're going to start with is just positioning our conversation with a little article that was put in Outside through the column Sweat Science. Some of you may be familiar with the Sweat Science column. It's by an author named Alex Hutchinson, who wrote the book Endure, Mind, Body, and the Curious Elasticity Limits of Human Performance. And in that article in Outside, he talks about training your breathing muscles to prepare for altitude. And he says, when you head to altitude, you have to breathe more deeply and more frequently to compensate for the scarcity of oxygen in that thin air. That means that the muscles that you use to inhale in particular have to work way harder than normal. In fact, those muscles consume 15 to 30% of the total oxygen that you inhale at altitude, and they eventually get tired. So training those muscles should prepare you to handle that extra work of breathing at altitude. And what we are covering today is breathwork training specifically to handle the needs of breathing at altitude. What we are going to be going through is this agenda. We're going to talk about what challenges that your respiratory system faces at altitude and what exactly is breathwork training. I know that's probably the top question here. What is breathwork training? There's a lot of different things out there in the world about breathwork training. So what is it as it relates to high altitude and mountaineering? What does the research literature say about breathwork training? Then we're going to get your own breath assessments, and you're going to get a taste of what breathwork training really feels like. And then we're going to finish with what you can do moving forward from this point. I am Anthony Lorubbio. I am the founder of a company called Recal. And at our core, we started our company to combine two things: mindfulness and all of what that might mean, and adventure travel and all of what that might mean. And over the course of a few years, what we found with our clients was the type of mindfulness that stuck out to them and was most tangible, and the thing that they latched onto the most was breathwork training. And then in adventure travel, we found that our clients like to summit mountains. So over time, we started to combine those two things, breathwork and summiting mountains. And I personally took a deep dive into breathwork training, first in something called the Wim Hof method. If some of you out there are familiar with the Wim Hof method, then I trickled into something called Oxygen Advantage, which is breathwork training, but for a specific purpose around sports and general health and wellness, but really sports optimization and performance. And then I rounded out my breathwork certifications with something called the Peak Flow, health, wellness, sport performance. And there's a specific sliver of Oxygen Advantage that's around high altitude simulation training. And what I did was look at all the research and the science around that. And quite frankly, I was astonished at what you could potentially do using breathwork training and relating it to your endeavors in the altitude. And that's when I eventually created the high altitude breathwork training program, which we've been running now for a little over a year now, has it been public to everybody out there who wants to dive in. Now, as I mentioned, I looked at a lot of research on paper, and it all sounded really nice, but I'm not a guy that just operates on nice. And unfortunately for me, I concocted a few maybe cruel experiments to test out some of the things that I saw on paper with breathwork training. And that started with something called the nasal marathon, where I trained for a marathon. But the way in which I trained for that marathon was entirely with breathwork training only. And by the way, prior to running this marathon, I had never run more than 6 miles at a time in my life. So obviously I'm not well adapted to endurance up to that point. Then after training using breathwork, I then ran the marathon with my mouth taped shut. So I only breathed through my nose for the duration of that marathon. I learned a lot about the adaptations that you can do using breathwork training, specifically around endurance in your muscles. Then I took it upon myself to challenge myself in the altitude now, and we created a challenge called the Sea Level to 14er, which basically means that I trained at sea level using breathwork training and then took on one of Colorado's 14,000 foot peaks. And I got to see what you can do at sea level and how that exactly translates to an elevation of 14,000 feet and above. I've since gone above and beyond that, and I've shared it with other athletes and IFMGA certified mountain guides, recreational athletes who've been maybe foolish enough to sign up for some of their own high endeavors, no pun intended. And we've gotten a lot of feedback, and eventually that is what led us to the high altitude breathwork training program. Now, to kick things off, we're going to do a little breath self-assessment right out of the gate. This is breath assessment number 1 out of 3 that we're going to do today. And that is something inspired by Oxygen Advantage, one of those breathwork certification programs that I mentioned earlier, called the BOLT score, or body oxygen level test. So if you want to do it with me, go ahead and sit. If you're not already, sit in a chair. We begin in a seated position. What this is going to test is your body's automatic response to the feeling of breathlessness. We're going to do a short breath hold, but it's not a maximum breath hold by any means. It's just a test of when your body starts to show signs of stress that it needs to breathe. And what that might look like for you is 3 most common ways. The first one is during this breath hold, when you get to the point that maybe your body involuntarily swallows, that is a first sign of stress in the body that it needs to breathe. A second one is that the muscles in your neck might twitch or clench up. So have a heads up for that. And then the third and final one is your diaphragm muscle, that dome-shaped muscle beneath your lungs, that might contract and flatten out. So you might feel that. That's a sign of stress in your body that you need to breathe. So during this breath hold, you're looking for one of those signs. So how it works is we're going to take a normal breath in and a normal breath out. We're not pushing the air out, just a normal passive exhale. You're then going to pinch your nose and hold your breath. We're going to begin a timer then. As that timer is going, you're just observing your body, and you're going to look for that first sign of stress in the body that you need to breathe. So sitting up nice and straight, relaxing your shoulders down. We're going to take a normal breath in through your nose and a normal passive breath out. Now go ahead and pinch your nose and hold your breath. The timer is running and you're waiting for that first sign of stress in your body that you need to breathe. Maybe you swallow, maybe your neck muscles, or maybe your diaphragm contracts. Just waiting for one of those signs. I'm going to let the timer run just a little while longer. Good. If you're still going, awesome. And a huge thumbs up for you. The way that you can test yourself if you're doing that assessment correctly is when you come out of that breath hold, you should still be in control of your breath. This is also known as a control pause in other styles of breath work. So that is a breath assessment of where you're at with your own body's automatic response to that feeling of breathlessness. And you might be wondering, okay, Anthony, how good was my BOLT score? Or what are these other 2 assessments that you talked about? And lastly, how can I improve upon that breath assessment? Well, my answer to you at this moment, at least, is stick around and find out. We will be covering the other assessments and what you can do to improve as we go through this webinar. But as the agenda stated, we are next going to dive into what challenges that you're going to face at altitude as it relates to your respiratory system. Now, I want to make a disclaimer. I am not a medical doctor, right? If and when you sign yourself up for a high altitude endeavor, I always recommend that you do seek consultation from your doctor. I know Climbing the 7 Summits has their medical doctors that are on site for their expeditions and for various resources leading up to an expedition. So I always recommend that you go seek that. What I have is a very thin sliver of knowledge in and around respiratory system and as it relates to altitude, and that's what I'm going to be faced with talking about today. So what happens at altitude? There's really 3 key things that I want to go through. The first of 3 things here is that you may experience an increase in your ventilation or your respiratory rate. That's simply the number of breaths that you take per minute. Another thing you may face at altitude is an increase in the hemoglobin concentration. That's your red blood cell count over time during acclimatization on the mountain. And number 3, what you might face at altitude is a decrease in the oxygen saturation of your blood, leading to a decrease in aerobic power as well as VO2 max. Now, let's zoom in on that increased ventilation piece of the puzzle and talk about that first of our three challenges. So what's really happening behind the scenes here? Well, number one, air pressure decreases as you climb up and up and up in elevation. For example, the partial pressure of oxygen when you're just at lame old sea level. I'm just kidding. Sea level's fine. Nothing against sea level. But at sea level, the partial pressure of oxygen is about 160 millimeters of mercury. That's a unit of measurement around pressure, right? Well, if you were to climb a 14er in Colorado, say, or any of the 14ers in and around the US, Alaska, etc., at 14,000 feet, that partial pressure of oxygen drops to 95 millimeters of mercury. That's 60% of the level that you saw at sea level. Well, if you're one of the few select people that are gunning for Everest this spring, what you're going to be facing is a partial pressure of oxygen of 53 millimeters of mercury. That's 33% of the level that you'd see at sea level. So inherently, what you're seeing is less oxygen per inhaled breath. And then the chemoreceptors in your brainstem are going to be stimulated because of that. And so your ventilatory centers are going to respond by attempting to breathe faster. Well, I'm here as your breathwork coach for today, for at least the next hour, maybe your first breathwork coach ever. I'm here to tell you that breathing faster is not always better, especially if you have poor breathing mechanics or if you haven't trained your respiratory muscles to take on that extra load that it's going to face at altitude, in particular in your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles. So this sets the stage for that first of three altitude challenges. So zoom back out. We're going to then jump into that second one, which is basically the time that it takes for acclimatization and that increase in hemoglobin, specifically that red blood cell count increase. So what's happening here? Number one, your kidneys, due to the fact that you're inhaling less oxygen per inhaled breath, starts to receive less oxygen, right? Makes sense. What the kidneys are going to respond with is the increase in the synthesis of EPO, erythropoietin. Some of you might be familiar with EPO, right? It is what basically leads to the creation of new red blood cells or hemoglobin. However, this process as a whole to create new red blood cells on the mountain takes time. That time is known as your acclimatization time on the mountain. And it can be very challenging for many people. And just simply put, time is very valuable, and therefore it faces a challenge when it comes to wanting to climb high mountains. So zooming out again, once again, taking a look at the three different challenges that we're going to face. That third one now, zooming in there, let's talk about this challenge. Due to that lower oxygen availability in the air around you, your blood oxygen saturation may decrease. Now, depending on the elevation or the acclimatization level of you and your body at any point in time, that can reach as low as 80, 70, even lower percent. Now, normally in a healthy human being, your oxygen saturation is between 95 and 100, right? 80, 70 or beyond is a challenge that one might face. As a result of that lower blood oxygen saturation, you may experience a total decreased aerobic power as well as total oxygen uptake capacity. That's known as that VO2 max. That may decrease for you at altitude. So that presents us with that third challenge at altitude. So you might be wondering, all right, great, Anthony, awesome. Thanks for this list of challenges. What exactly does breathwork training have to do with all these things? Well, that's right. Let's now make the connection. Let's look at these three challenges and see how breathwork training addresses each of them. Well, I shouldn't say any, but the way in which we approach breathwork training is with three different sides. There's three different sides to our breathwork training program. The first side is mechanical efficiency to your breathing, your biomechanical efficiency of how you're breathing. That, as you can see, maybe you're picking up what I'm putting down, that directly relates to the increase in the ventilation that you may experience at altitude. And then the second side of breathwork training is high altitude adaptation. What adaptations can you make from anywhere in the world that might prepare you for that acclimatization time and therefore that increased hemoglobin? And lastly, the third side of breathwork training, at least from our approach, is with respiratory muscle training. This here is kind of the juggernaut, right? Mechanical efficiency is the foundation. High altitude adaptation is the complement to everything and acclimatization. Respiratory muscle training, this here is the big piece of the puzzle. And that can directly address that decrease in oxygen saturation that you may face. So these are the three sides of breathwork training. Let's take a closer look at breathwork for mechanical efficiency purposes. What breathwork training can do is start to fix and correct and improve your habits and how you breathe. And therefore, then it can improve the efficiency of your breathing. So what do I mean when I reference good habits when it comes to breathing? If there's one thing that I want you to take away, well, there's going to be a couple, but this one in particular, I want you to take away from this webinar is what proper breathing really looks like. And when we think of proper breathing, I want you to think of a three-part formula, which is nose, slow, and low. Breathe through your nose, breathe slowly, and breathe low into the lowest part of your lungs where most of the gas diffusion into your bloodstream actually occurs. NSL, nose, slow, and low. By breathing this way, you can fix some of those mechanical inefficiencies and then eliminate the impact of dead space that you have on each breath. Dead space is basically the space between the entrance of your nostrils down into the lower part of your lungs where gas diffusion is happening. This is unused air, right? That's our dead space. We can eliminate the impact of that dead space with each and every breath. You can also increase your lung capacity using breathwork training, and then you can mechanically use that extra lung capacity that you achieved during breathwork training. Breathwork training can also address ways in which you can properly engage your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles. It can also eliminate overbreathing, especially when you arrive at altitude. And subsequently, by eliminating overbreathing, you can then eliminate respiratory alkalosis, which is essentially saying when you overbreathe, you offload carbon dioxide. And if you get rid of a lot of carbon dioxide, the pH of your blood goes up, meaning it becomes more alkaline. Now, that's related, I'm drawing another connection here, that's related to something called the Bohr effect, which effectively means that there is a connection between the hemoglobin in your red blood cells, that's what's delivering oxygen throughout your body, and that oxygen molecule that comes in through your lungs. There's a connection between those two things, an affinity, some may say in the research. That affinity in more alkaline environments, a higher pH, is stronger, which means the hemoglobin in your red blood cells not going to release the oxygen quite as easily as, say, in a slightly lower pH environment where it will distribute it. Therefore, if you can eliminate overbreathing, you're then enabling the oxygen to hop off of the hemoglobin in your red blood cells and get into, say, the muscle tissue that might need it for you and your endeavors for trekking and climbing at altitude. Let's take a look at what the research literature has to say about mechanical efficiency and how it relates to high altitude. So there was a study done on what slow, deep breathing, that's like a mechanically efficient breath, can do for test subjects at high altitude. So they took lowlanders. That sounds really low of them to call someone that lives at sea level. I've lived many times in my life at sea level. They took lowlanders and they brought them up to 4,600 meters, for example, which is just 14,500 or so is going to be my guess on that, 14,600, 700 feet. That's a quick conversion. And also 5,400 meters. And they tested their SpO2, which is essentially oxygen saturation in the blood, when they changed their breathing to slow, deep breathing. After just 15 minutes of changing the way that somebody breathes can result in, based on this research study, an increase in somebody's SpO2 levels between 7.6% and 9.3%, just by changing the way in which you breathe. So from a breathwork training standpoint, we want to teach you and start to unlearn some bad habits to make room for good habits, what mechanical efficient breathing feels like, and build that habit of slow, deep breathing. Now, let's zoom back out. We're going to now dive into that high altitude adaptation piece of the puzzle here. And we're going to look at specifically a breathwork training protocol called intermittent hypoxic hypercapnic training. Some people consider this, generally speaking, high altitude simulation training. But using this type of training, you can actually increase the hemoglobin concentration that's in your blood and subsequently somebody's VO2 max. But another big piece of the puzzle is not just about the hemoglobin concentration increase you can experience with this style of breathwork training, intermittent hypoxic hypercapnic training. You can also increase CO2 tolerance. There's a whole subset of breathwork training around CO2 tolerance training. And if you can achieve a higher CO2 tolerance, number one, you can feel less breathless when you're exerting yourself, both in exercise and on the mountain. And number two, you can decrease the RPE, which is rate of perceived exertion, which is directly tied to higher endurance if you have a lower RPE. And due to a higher CO2 tolerance, you can then also prevent overbreathing because your body's not trying to constantly get rid of the CO2 through exhales, right? That, of course, then leads to that Bohr effect that we talked about, which means the oxygen is not just getting into the blood, but it's getting out of the blood and into the muscle tissue that needs it most in those moments of high exertion. CO2 tolerance is a really key part of the equation when it comes to breathwork training. So let's look at what the literature says about this particular style of breathwork training. There was a study done with athletes who did this intermittent hypoxic hypercapnic training and the subsequent impact on their hemoglobin concentration and VO2 max. So using IHHT protocols, which are effectively, to put it simply, it's effectively breath hold and movement, right? Because we want to go hypoxic, which means low oxygen, and you can achieve that depending on your CO2 tolerance through a breath hold. But really, you're also going into hypercapnic, which means high carbon dioxide. The combination hypercapnic, hypoxic with body movement is what this experiment was all about. So these test subjects did this 3 times a week for 8 weeks. And what they saw as a result of this style of training was really remarkable. It was an increase of 5.35% of their hemoglobin concentration in their blood, which then resulted in an increase of nearly 11% of their VO2 max. Again, that's that total oxygen uptake capacity that you have. Vitally important metric when it comes to both endurance and altitude. So these are the numbers that people saw from this particular study. Okay, pause. We're going to do breath assessment number 2 now, just to shake things up a bit. This second breath assessment is called a carbon dioxide tolerance test. Now that I just talked all about carbon dioxide, I hope that everybody's ears and antennas are up and open for this particular test. The way that a carbon dioxide tolerance test works is we're going to take a normal breath in, a normal breath out. Then we're going to take a really deep breath. Try to fill up your lungs as much as you possibly can in an informal way. This is gauging your lung capacity. At the top of that inhale, you're then going to begin a very slow exhale at the same time that I start the timer. The challenge of this test is you're going to try to extend that exhale as long as you possibly can extend it for in one continuous exhale. So it's like the air, preferably through your nose, is just leaking out in this exhale, and you try to extend that for as long as you possibly can. I will start the timer when we get to that point, and the time that's shown on the screen when you're done with that full exhale or whenever you need to take a new breath is going to be your COTT score. So go ahead and sit up nice and straight if you want to do this with me here. Relaxing your arms down to your side. We're going to take a normal breath together. So go ahead and begin a normal inhale. Key on normal inhale. Normal exhale. Good. Now begin that deep inhale. Fill up your lungs as much as you can. Fill up, fill up. See if you can sniff in a bit more air. And now begin that slow exhale. As slow as you can make it, preferably through your nose. You're trying to extend this exhale as long as you can. Maybe work with that throat lock mechanism, kind of like you're fogging up a mirror in the back of your throat. That lion's breath, if you're familiar with pranayama, and try to extend this exhale as long as you can go. This is going to challenge both your mental resilience and that physical sensation of carbon dioxide rising in the blood. I'm going to let the timer run for another 20 seconds or so. Just focus on the breath. Extend that exhale. You'll get to the point that you're squeezing all the air out of your lungs. I'll let the timer run for just 5 more seconds. If you're still going, awesome. 3, 2, 1. You're still going, great. Go ahead and take a normal breath, move your body, shake that out. That one was likely a bit more stressful than that BOLT score where we just did the body's automatic response to breathlessness. Here, we brought in a bit more of a challenge in trying to maximize the length of one exhale. If you're still going, by the way, good for you. You have a nice CO2 TT score. Speaking of, if you're wondering how your scores are going, again, we're going to address that here toward the end of the webinar. All right, let's move on now. We're going right back to where we were, but focused in now on that third category of breathwork training, which is our respiratory muscle training. And specifically, when I talk about respiratory muscle training, I am mostly referring to the diaphragm muscle. Again, that dome-shaped muscle that you can see in the image there that's located beneath your lungs, connected to the bottom parts of your rib cage, 360 degrees around your thoracic cavity, as well as your intercostal muscles. Those are your secondary muscles, in particular on your inspiration, your inhalation, as well as your abdomen, which is primary in an exhale. Those are your respiratory muscles. And for those of you that have never seen a diaphragm in action, here's a little video. You can see that diaphragm, it's that dome. As you inhale, it flattens out. So when someone says that they're contracting of the muscles in your diaphragm, it's on an inhale and it flattens out to create the space in your lungs to allow air to come in. Basically just changes the pressure inside your lungs. Your lungs inherently don't have muscles. They are just bringing in and out volumes of air. Now, your intercostal muscles are there located between each rib bone in your rib cage, and they're secondary to the primarily that inhalation, but you also have the internal intercostal muscles that are involved in exhalation as well. So there's outer and inner intercostal muscles. What does breathwork training have to say specifically around respiratory muscle training and what you can do with that? Well, number one, you can maintain a higher blood oxygen saturation when you're at altitude after training with respiratory muscle training. Number two, you can reduce the respiratory muscle fatigue that one might face, but also you can delay something called the respiratory muscle metabolic reflex activation, which effectively means that the muscles in your respiratory system start to absorb all of the available oxygen and blood, and they don't push that blood out to the locomotor muscles of your legs and your arms. So by training your respiratory muscles, you can then actually increase the blood flow that does get out to those locomotor muscles. You can also increase the capacity that you have to adapt to hypoxia, which means low oxygen, which is in particular critical while in acclimatization on the mountain. You can also minimize the impact of respiratory stress that you're going to face during acclimatization. And in general, you can improve the breathing economy. So how much energy are you expending for breathing? By training the muscles that are specifically designed to do your breathing and not pulling from other muscle groups to do some of that breathing for you. That would be economically inefficient. So you can improve your breathing economy by training these muscles. Now, I want to make a key note that there are inspiratory muscles as well as expiratory. And so any good respiratory muscle training plan needs to focus on both of those because it is about gas exchange and not just one-way gas flow. Now, let's see what the literature has to say about respiratory muscle training. So there was a general review done on multiple studies around respiratory muscle training and how it may or may not improve endurance in hypoxia. So this review looked at 7 different studies that covered both respiratory muscle endurance training and respiratory muscle strength training. And what they found was that respiratory muscle training can improve respiratory efficiency, breathing patterns. It can lower anybody's abnormal dyspnea breathing habits, and it can improve total physical performance of somebody at altitude or in hypoxia. Thus, what they say at the end of this review is that this is a recommended method to be used as a pre-exposure tool, exposure as into altitude, a pre-exposure tool for strengthening respiratory muscles and minimizing the adverse effects caused by hypoxia. Now, one of the studies that they looked at in this review was a study on inspiratory muscle training and its impact on SpO2 at altitude. And the reason why they focused a bit on inspiratory muscles and why I want to focus on it as well here is because, as I mentioned earlier, the air, when you're at higher elevations, is less dense. And you may know this from your, science class in high school or something. A gas moves from a high pressure space to a low pressure space. Well, at altitude, you're only in a low pressure space. Therefore, that air is not going to move as easily into your thoracic cavity, your lungs, right? So it's going to take more work for you to inspire, to literally pull in the air into your lungs. And so this study looked at inspiratory muscle training and its impact at altitude in that thinner, lower pressure air. And so these test subjects, they trained 2 times per day for 4 weeks using a device. In this particular case, it was called a power breathe device, which resisted the air at 50%. So 50% of the air being inhaled was resisted. Therefore, it took extra work for them to inhale. Then, after this 4 weeks of training, they went on an expedition in the Himalayas. They were tested at various altitudes of what their SpO2 resulted at: 0 meters, 400 meters, 1400 meters, 4880, and 5550 meters. Now, as a result of the study, number one, they did find that doing this inspiratory muscle training with 50% air-resisted inhales, their strength of their inhales, which used a metric called MIP, maximal inspiratory pressure, MIP, that increased by 15%. So, okay, great. They actually strengthened their muscles. Now, did it actually convert on the mountain? Did it show benefits there? And what they found was it did not show benefits at any altitude that was less than 4,880. But it wasn't until that level that they then saw an increase in that test group in their SpO2. So from 4,880 and above, they saw on average a 6% increase in the SpO2, the blood oxygen saturation level of those people, and as much as 10% versus the group that did not do the training. So you can see some consistencies here. In this example, inspiratory muscle training, you're seeing a rise in SpO2. In that mechanical efficiency example, by just changing the way in which you breathe, that also can increase the SpO2. This training was just regular breathing at rest, right? They didn't even change the way in which they breathe. This is just as a result of the strength here. There are multiple ways for you to increase the oxygen saturation that you face at altitude. So this is all fine and good and dandy. And you might be saying, all right, Anthony, this is a lot of research. Now, how can we bring it out of the lab and into the real world of the mountains, where we want to enjoy our expedition more and not just be suffering through the breathing that you're going to face at altitude? You want to perform better on the mountain. So how can we bring it out of the lab and into the real world? And that is what we ultimately did in creating our high altitude breathwork training program, which is a 5-week breathwork training program designed to fit nicely into that pre-acclimatization fitness block, the last 5 weeks before an expedition, designed for altitude endurance. And we've had many people at this point do this training: athletes, pro athletes, IFMGA certified mountain guides, medical doctors. We've had people climb some of the world's highest peaks in doing this. We've had people race in races like the Leadville 100, the Bear 100. So there's been multiple applications used around our high altitude breathwork training and what they did on the mountain, and with phenomenal results. We've even been lucky enough to be featured in the media a bit as well, and what people have done using breathwork training and then climbing some of the world's highest peaks. So I want you to be able to experience more of what this style of breathwork training is all about. And that's what we're going to move into next. Let's round out the breath assessments with that third of 3 breath assessments, which is something called a maximum breathlessness test. This is also, again, pulled from Oxygen Advantage. And what this is going to do is going to be the most challenging breath assessment that we've done so far today. This is truly going to be a maximum, okay? It's going to start just like the BOLT score, the body oxygen level test. It's going to start the same way. We're going to take a normal breath in and a normal breath out. However, we're going to hold our breath here, but 2 differences. Number 1, you're going to be standing when you do this to start. And then number 2, when you start that breath hold, I want you to walk. And as you're walking, I want you to count the number of steps that you're walking. I want you to walk at a hiker's pace, right? You can walk in a circle if you need, or back and forth, whatever space requirements that you have. But it basically looks like this. From a standing position, take a normal breath in, normal breath out, pinch the nose, hold the breath, and walk. Don't forget to count the number of steps, and don't forget the number of steps that you walked when you get done, because it is going to be a very high stress situation in having held your breath for as long as you can. So if you want to join me in this, go ahead and stand up. And from that standing position, we're going to begin. Go ahead and take a normal breath now in through your nose, and then a normal breath out. Pinch your nose and hold your breath and begin walking at a normal hiker's pace here. Count the number of steps that you walk. Go as long as you can on this one breath. Don't forget to count those steps, and try not to forget the number of steps that you walked. I'll give everybody about 5 more seconds or so. If you're still walking, good for you. Everybody else can come on back to their computers or their phones or whatever they're using to watch this. Does everybody remember the number of steps that you walked? That can be challenging, because this is not just testing things like your carbon dioxide tolerance. It's also testing your mental, cognitive ability to stay sharp amidst that stress of breathlessness. So hopefully by now you have those 3 assessments written down somewhere or written and etched in your memory. And you might be wondering, okay, we've got the BOLT score, we've got the CO2 TT, and we've got the MBT. Now, how did I do, Anthony? Well, I'm finally going to share that with you. What's going to show up next is a chart. And in that chart, it's going to break down the BOLT score, CO2 TT, and MBT scores of a range of numbers that can use some improvement, and that's going to be labeled dysfunctional breathing. I'm not the one that made up the names that are tied to these scores, so don't blame me for that word dysfunctional there. And then there's going to be a range of scores that show more functional breathing habits are likely present in the way that you breathe. Here's that chart. So as you can see, that threshold where you can cross over from dysfunctional signs of dysfunctional breathing, I would say, to signs of functional breathing is 25 on the BOLT score, 60 on the CO2 TT, and 60 on the MBT. But know a few things here about these scores. Number 1, if you scored not as high as you would like, that's okay. Some of the high altitude breathwork training is specifically targeted toward these scores, and some of the results that you can see in a matter of a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I've had many clients at this point come in with scores, in the teens on the BOLT score, in the 20 to 30 range on a CO2 TT, and literally increase by 50%, increase by double, even more than that. If you're training for an expedition that has a high altitude component, I like to shoot for, on the CO2 TT and MBT are really the scores I focus on a bit more, but I'd like to see you above an 80 in both of those scores, the CO2 TT and an MBT, if you have a high altitude expedition ahead of you. And if you don't have that score already, that's okay. We can work toward it. But number 2, there are some things that impact these scores, things like how much caffeine you've had so far today, how much you've eaten, have you eaten, have you not? Have you started that metabolism process? What elevation are you at right now? And also, what hormones are you facing in your body right now, in particular with women? So this is really just a baseline that should give you an idea of what you can then work toward in training, aka how can you improve your scores now that we have a baseline. I'm going to coach you right now on one of our breathwork training exercises, And then I'm going to give you a few examples of some things that you can do on your own. And then I'm going to talk about what you can do with breathwork training from here. But guided right now, I'm going to take you through one of our CO2 tolerance training exercises. This is called Breathe Light. Again, credit to Oxygen Advantage for this particular breathwork training protocol. As you can see, a lot of credit goes to Oxygen Advantage for a lot of this work. In Breathe Light, what we're going to do right now is literally breathe lighter than we normally would. Somebody didn't get too fancy by naming this particular protocol. So from a seated position, go ahead and sit up nice and straight, but relaxed posture. And what I want you to do is take that pointer finger of yours and put it beneath your nose, just resting on your upper lip. And here I want you to take a couple of breaths in and out through your nose. And as you take these breaths through your nose, can you feel the air as it runs across your finger on the way in? And then maybe more moist, warmer air run out across your finger on the way out? Good. Now that you have a baseline of what breathing feels like, go ahead and start to slow down your breathing. Breathe lighter than you normally would to the point that you can barely, if at all, feel the air running across your finger on the way in and back out across your finger. Slowing down your breathing here. What we're doing is we're intentionally trying to invite the feeling of air hunger, that feeling like you want to take a deeper breath, right? Try to reach a level of breathing that you can maintain for the next 30 seconds or so, breathing in this way, becoming friends with that uncomfortable feeling. That is simply carbon dioxide rising in your blood. If at any point in time your breathing becomes too erratic, especially at the top of an inhale or the bottom of an exhale, go ahead and take a couple of normal breaths and try to come back to that slow, light breathing. We're here for the next 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Good. Go ahead and relax now. Breathe normally here. In fact, I've got a breathwork protocol just for this moment. We're going to do a couple of physiological sighs, which is essentially a double inhale through the nose and an exhale through the mouth. We want to offload that CO2 very quickly here. This is not part of training. I'm just showing it to you in case you're exercising or you're on the mountain and you need to offload CO2 quickly. So go ahead and take an inhale through your nose and then pause for just a moment and then inhale again through your nose and then exhale through your mouth. Let's do one more just like that. Inhale through your nose, pause, sniff in again, exhale through your mouth. Good. Scientifically speaking, this is the single quickest way for you to offload carbon dioxide. So if you're feeling out of breath in the midst of exercise, this is something that you can use in that moment. But note that this offloads CO2. A part of our training is that we're trying to create more tolerance to CO2. So I would use that sparingly because essentially we are trying to train our body to be able to tolerate more CO2. But I still wanted to just teach you that little protocol. So let's talk about some other example exercises. On the respiratory muscle training side, I'm not going to guide you through this, but I just want to show it to you. A part of our training includes something called the hook-lying diaphragmatic breathing exercise. This specifically targets our inspiratory muscle strength. And the way that it works is laying down in a hook-lying position, which looks like the image here. Your feet are flat on the ground, your knees at a 90-degree angle. You take strong inhales through the nose, experience some of that resistance that happens with your nose. Inherently, when you inhale through your nose, you're actually engaging your diaphragm more because of that resistance that you face with your nose. And that's good because that's going to engage the diaphragm and it's going to send air lower into the bottom parts of your lungs, which is where most of your gas diffusion happens. So by taking a few strong inhales and just passive exhales, you can start to train the strength of your diaphragm. There's a couple of ways to make this even more challenging. You can block one nostril, which if you've got two nostrils and you're blocking one, that is what percentage? That's 50% of air resistance, which kind of sounds like that research study that we talked about earlier. So this is your air resistance device and it's completely free. It's your finger and you're putting it putting it on the side of your nose to block one nostril. A second way that you can add resistance and create more of a challenging experience here is by adding weight or a resistance band to your lower belly. Now that's inspiratory muscle training exercise. Let's look at an expiratory muscle training exercise. It's a fun one. It's called balloon breathing. Yes, kids and balloons seem to be the best balloon breathers. The way that this works is you have a balloon in hand, and what you do is you take full exhales to blow up that balloon. You want to push out as much air as you can with each and every breath. And then maybe you time yourself for a minute and try to do that as many times as you can in 1 minute. A way that you can make this even more challenging is doing it in a 90-90 position, like you see in the image here. So that is a respiratory muscle training exercise called balloon breathing to train your expiratory muscles, in particular your abdomen and your inner intercostal muscles. Now let's look at the high altitude simulation side of things. This is a walk to jog variation of what we've looked at in the research called intermittent hypoxic hypercapnic training. I, again, will not coach you through this here on this webinar, but I want to at least expose you to this. It starts similarly to the way in which you started the maximum breathlessness test. So from a standing position, you take a normal breath in, normal breath out, you pinch your nose and hold your breath and begin walking. Now, when it becomes difficult, when you reach a level of medium to strong air hunger, instead of stopping, you actually begin jogging. As you can see, this is very challenging. And you jog until you can't go any further on that one breath, come to a stop. And now is the most critical moment in this exercise. I'm showing you this diagram here. Where we're at is at the top. You can see the lines here. We've started walking and then we go into a jog. When you can't go any further, you may see those little up and down marks on that line. That indicates that you take minimal breaths in and out through your nose, just shuttling air in and out through your nostril for about 6 of those mini breaths. This is the extremely challenging moment of this exercise. Then to recover, you can continue normal breathing. What's going to happen in those 6 minimal breaths, by the way, is it's almost tricking your diaphragm to think that you're taking a full inhale, and that diaphragm is going to contract and build some strength, as well as obviously training your CO2 tolerance here and a potential hypoxic response in the body. So this is a high altitude simulation exercise known as the walk to jog variation. There are a lot of other variations, more sport specific, depending on what you're doing and what you're training for, but this is effectively what it looks like. So we talked a lot about what breathwork training looks like what you can do before heading out on an expedition. But that's just a part of the equation, right? It's also about what can you do on the mountain itself. And as part of our training, we do also coach on mountain protocols. These include something as simple as how to breathe, period, like all the time when you're on the mountain. It includes recovery breathing, which is something that's great to deploy after an acclimatization hike, right? When you climb high, sleep low. After one of those hikes high, you come back. This is a breathwork protocol to recover after that acclimatization hike. And then we also have a specific breathing protocol in a couple of variations if you start to experience some symptoms around acute mountain sickness, AMS. Obviously, a note, if you ever start to experience any sort of symptoms when you're on the mountain, always speak up and communicate that, in particular with CTSS, to one of the doctors that they have on site. But this is a protocol that you can use to hopefully fend off some of those symptoms that you're experiencing. So where can you go from here? Well, there are 3 ways to train as it relates to our breathwork training program. The first way to train, and by the way, I'm going to show a few prices here. That's just for you to generally understand the different prices in our 3 ways to train. The first way to train is with personal training. And this is a one-on-one training program that's tailored to your needs, where you're at with your assessments and what you have coming up on the mountain. It's a customized training plan for you. The second way that you can train is with an online video course that we've created that's got videos, demonstrations, a lot of explanations and insights around the training, shot by, yes, yours truly. So unfortunately, if you do that training program, you will have to listen to me on video a lot. And then lastly, the final way is completely self-guided. And this is our most accessible version of the training. And here you get the written explanations of all the training protocols and a workbook to go along with it. Now, I am super excited to finally say that By the end of this week, we will have our Training Peaks plan up and running for you. So if you, in fact, already use the Training Peaks platform, the app, and maybe even work with a coach for your physical training, now you can have breathwork training as a complement to that on the Training Peaks platform. You might also be wondering, how does this training fit into your schedule? And there's really two options that you can approach the training. Option one is taking 15 to 20 minutes per day for 6 days out of the week. Obviously, rest on the seventh day then. Option number two is that you bundle two of the sides of the breathwork training, specifically the high altitude simulation work and the respiratory muscle training work, combine them into one day, which would be about 30 to 40 minutes, and you do that 3 times a week. This training as a whole is designed to complement your physical fitness training that you're doing, specifically and especially during the pre-acclimatization block of training. Of course, if you have more time, that's going to be better. You're going to see better results. But this training specifically geared toward that final period of time before your expedition. And the protocols work really well as either a warm up or a cool down to whatever other physical training that you're doing. So we created a special landing page just for those of you watching the webinar, where you can scan that QR code, get sent to the landing page on our site, or if you're old fashioned, you can actually type in our website into the URL bar in your browser, recaltravel.com/CTSS, and that will land you on a page that will help you take the next steps. If you want to follow us on Instagram or Facebook, there's our handles. We actually just launched a 100 Days to Everest content campaign for those of you not just climbing Everest. If you're climbing any mountain coming up, this is really valuable content for you. And of course, you can always email us as well. I would like to finish our webinar by bringing to you Lisa Thompson, who actually was a part of a recent webinar with CTSS fitness training for Mountaineers, which was back in October. We've worked with her in the past. We've worked with some of her clients. She's experienced the training herself. She's an incredible human being. So on top of being a mountaineer, a coach of athletes, and also, by the way, the second ever USA woman to summit K2, she's an amazing human. And this is what she had to say about our breathwork training program. As both a high altitude climber and a coach preparing others for mountain adventures, I cannot overstate the value of Recal's breathwork training program. I've seen firsthand how this program helps my athletes acclimatize more effectively, recover faster, and perform their best. Recal is a game changer for anyone looking to optimize their experience in the mountains, whether they're tackling their first high altitude trek or aiming for a more technical summit. I am very humbled for her to have said those words, and also proud of what we've created with our breathwork training program.
Awesome. I also want to make a quick connection here. Lisa, of course, did this webinar with Mark Postal while we were all together. And folks, I wanted to mention that Lisa is one of our trainers that we work with. She's one of the many experts we work with. She is quite incredible. If you have signed up for a CTSS expedition, there is a strong chance that you have a training plan actually designed by Lisa herself, which is really neat and a great connection there. So I think the wonderful thing is all these people, all these different experts are really connected. So what I want to do right now is just bring this back home to Climbing the Seven Summits. Many of you are climbing in Nepal with us this season. We're really excited about that. If you notice Anthony's kind of urgency of saying, hey, we're kicking off this training on Thursday, is because we really did count 5 weeks plus back. And we made sure to snug this webinar in with enough time for you to execute all of it, execute any of the training plans for 5 weeks before you take off for Kathmandu and land in Nepal. So we would try to be very mindful of that. If you have a future expedition, you can, of course, still jump on all of the resources and free things that he's offering. And then you might think about how this will fit into your training plan, take advantage of that consultation call to let Anthony know what you're doing. So I just wanted to paint a little bit of a picture for those that are unfamiliar with Climbing the Seven Summits about our philosophy. Of course, we have tons of experts like Lisa, like Mark Postal, like Anthony, that help all of our climbers. If you're looking for help with nutrition, with fitness training, with your breath, things like that, we're going to be here to make sure we connect you with these experts who are going to support you along your training and your journey. In addition, I also just want to mention that CTSS is known for our leadership and our guides. We have Mike Hamill, who founded the company, and he's just an incredible person and mountaineer. And then all of our guides really are compassionate, kind, and top notch at what they do. We do consider ourselves specialists when it comes to the 7 summits and progressing you along. So if you have a dream of climbing Aconcagua, or if you have a dream of climbing Everest one day, or maybe you just want to make it down to Ecuador, we can help get you there and make sure that you have a progression that fits your time, your budget, all those different things. And then we are just so zooming in on our marginal gains philosophy. Folks, I want to bring this up because I really think breath work drives this as well. We believe that little things we do on the mountain, before the mountain, like getting our mindset right, getting it all dialed in, making sure we take snacks we love to the mountain, making sure we take breaks and communicate and talk about how we're feeling. We believe all these little tiny things we do add up to really big gains on the mountain. And we think that that's really important to us. And so making sure that we connect you with folks like Anthony, folks like nutrition specialists, is part of that marginal gains philosophy. We want to make sure everyone is their best self on the mountain. And then the last note I want to include is just how much enormous mental and physical strength it takes to be on the mountain. We truly believe that to be on the mountain, we need to be humble, we need to be listening, we need to be talking and communicating. And those are things that set us apart from other operators, other expedition companies that are out there. You see a couple other different things there. We have a no dickheads policy, and we stand by that. We really have no time for that on the mountain these days, which also means that we're highly selective of who we put on the mountain, from guides to leadership to, of course, our clients as well. Folks, if you want to connect with CTSS, if you don't already know us, if you are just being introduced to us through this webinar, welcome. We're excited you're here. This is a link. You can schedule a free call with either Caroline or Mike. They are the co-founders of Climbing the 7 Summits, and you can talk about your goals and where you want to go next, which is great. And I want to go ahead and wrap things up now. So before we sign off, on behalf of Climbing the 7 Summits, I just want to give a massive thank you to Anthony for joining us and for bringing Recal and the high altitude breathwork training to all of us, to all of our climbers, and maybe all of our new climbers who will be joining us on an expedition in the future. Anthony, I'm going to leave the final words with you, and then we're going to sign off.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you about breathwork training for mountaineers specifically. I wish you all the best in both your training and on the mountain itself. And I'll leave you with the parting words of don't forget that formula, NSL, nose, slow, and low.
Awesome.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, folks, we'll see you hopefully at our next webinar. Take care. Bye.